we want to take a look at the process of scaling a graph of y equals x to the 0.5, or more generally y equals ax to the 0.5. For either of these graphs, the y factor would be 2 to the 0.5, which is approximately equal to 1.4. And 2 to the 0.5, of course, is also the square root of 2. The first step is going to be to construct our general graph. So here's a set of coordinate axes, and what we want to do is we want to mark the x-axis without actually indicating a scale. We want to mark the x-axis in such a way that our marks indicate x values that successively double. So I'll do that off camera. And that's now been done. There are two ways to do that. We can choose an initial marking, and then we simply double the distance of that marking from the origin and make another mark, double that distance, double that distance, double that distance. This should be familiar. Or we can start out here and cut these distances in half, each time going twice as close to the origin. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to mark our y-axis in factors of 1.4. And again, I'll do that off camera. Okay, here's a reasonable attempt at doing that. So we have a y factor approximately 1.4 from each point to the next. Okay, so we've marked the y-axis using factor 1.4. 1.4 being 140%, it means that every mark ought to be 140% of the distance of every mark from the axis ought to be 140% of the preceding. Which means that, for example, if we regard this as being 100, then this would be 140. If we regard this as being 100, then this would be 140, etc. Now we then plot our graph points. Now, in plotting the graph points, I can start by pairing up any one of these marks with any one of these marks. I'm going to choose the first mark, and I see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 marks here. Now, if I want the graph to go up to here, then I want to use 5 marks here, and that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I could start by pairing this mark with this one to get a point, and then I would have a point here to match these, and match these. That doesn't mean I have to use this mark. If I, for example, use this mark to pair with the first one, then this would be paired with the second, this would be paired with the third, this with the fourth, and this with the fifth. The graph would be a little bit flatter than it is if I do this. If I pair with this mark, then I don't have enough marks up here to do the whole graph. But the point is, I can do that pairing in any of a number of ways. Now, I'm going to choose to pair this point with this point. And I get a point here. Then this point with this point puts me about here. This point with this point, come up here and over here, that puts me about here. This one with this one puts me about here, and this one with this one puts me about up here. Now those aren't perfect. Remember, this is a hand-sketched graph. Also, note that if we keep having the x values and then keep decreasing the y values as we approach 0, we see that they both tend towards 0. There's a limit point at 0, as discussed elsewhere, so I can actually include 0, 0 on this graph. Even though you can't start at 0, 0 and double x, or increase y by factor 1.4, well, you can, but you end up with 0, because anytime you multiply 0 by a factor, you get 0. Even though then 0, 0 doesn't make sense on this graph if you think of doubling it. If you think of having the x values and then changing the y values such that each one is reciprocal of 1.4 times as great as the other. I don't want to go into that detail. You do approach 0, 0, so it makes sense to include 0, 0 on the graph, which gives us a graph. It has something like this shape. This point was a little low, and in hitting it, I ended up having to make this line almost straight, but the line continues to curve, and it should be obvious why. So now we have a reasonable, if somewhat flawed graph that represents, it can be used to represent y equals ax to the 0.5 for any constant value a. And of course, a could be 1, so this could represent y equals x to the 0.5. So we'll talk then about how this is scaled in the next segment here.